Hey everybody, this is Chapter 4 of Peter Drucker's Max Shachtman and His Left. The title of the chapter is War. By 1939, the approach of the Second World War cast a shadow over political discussions in the United States. Trotskyists were as foresighted as anyone in making out the shape of the approaching conflict. But the actual outbreak of the war in September showed that Shachtman disagreed with many other Trotskyists about how to respond to it. In the spring of 1940, Shachtman still saw himself as a Trotskyist, but others no longer saw Shachtman as a, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyist. Shachtman became a leader of his own organization with his own distinctive vision and strategy. Shachtman agreed with other Trotskyists in seeing the Second World War as an attempt by different national capitalisms to solve their crises at one another's expense, an attempt in which U.S. capitalism was also culpable. The government that had sent its Marines to Haiti and Nicaragua was now warding off German influence in South America. The government that had tried to forcibly impose a, quote, open door, end quote, for U.S. investment in China now tried to resist Japanese encroachment there. The government that had helped extract reparations and profits from Germany now resisted Germany's aggressive independence. But Shachtman differed from other Trotskyists in the strategy Shachtman put forward, a strategy based on solidarity with movements of resistance that might arise against any of the warring empires. Unlike others, Shachtman put the Soviet Union among the empires that had to be resisted. After the British and French capitulation at Munich, Trotsky predicted that Stalin would try to make a deal with Hitler. The result would be another world war and the, quote, physical extermination, end quote, of Eastern European Jews. The Socialist Workers Party was so convinced of war's inevitability that it held a special party convention in July 1939, devoted almost entirely to preparing for it. On the 23rd of August, Trotskyists were vindicated and liberals and communists thrown into confusion when Trotsky's predictions came true. Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact that guaranteed that the Soviet Union would not go to war with Germany even if Germany attacked Poland. Secret clauses of the agreement guaranteed a Soviet sphere of influence in eastern Poland, parenthesis, inhabited mostly by Belarusians and Ukrainians, end parenthesis, and the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The colonels who ruled Poland managed to drag Britain and France into war behind them despite the pact. But British and French armies stood by almost inactive as the German army crushed Poland and the Soviet army marched in to claim Stalin's share. In hindsight, the events of late 1939 seem more like a prologue to World War than the war itself. The main acts of the war came later. The first act in May-June 1940, when the German army attacked through Belgium, cut apart the French army, and occupied Western Europe. The second in June 1941, when the German army attacked the Soviet Union. The third in December 1941, when Japan attacked British, Dutch, and U.S. forces in Asia. Only after all these deals, betrayals, and attacks did the alignments of the war solidify. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union on one side, Germany and Japan on the other. The war that broke out in September 1939 looked different. The Soviet Union was aligned with Germany against Britain and France. In November 1939, Stalin moved to protect his northwestern flank by demanding that Finland turn over bases and territory to the Soviet Union. When Finland refused, the Soviet army attacked. Finland had been a base for British and French intervention against the Bolsheviks in 1918 to 1921. It seemed likely to become a British and French base again for an attack on the Soviet Union. And Trotsky, as foresight as ever, predicted that the bargain between Hitler and Stalin would break down and war would break out between Germany and the USSR. The Soviet wars against Poland and Finland were analyzed by Trotskyists in different ways. Sometimes the wars were seen primarily as conflicts between capitalist powers. Germany against Britain and France, with the USSR as a German ally. Sometimes they were seen as wars to expand the Soviet bureaucracy's own territory and power. Sometimes they were seen as preventative wars in defense of nationalized property, which could be threatened by either an Allied intervention in Finland or the expected German invasion. The Soviet wars were also entangled in other wars. The defensive war China had been fighting since Japan attacked in 1937, the war of resistance Europeans would soon be waging against German occupation, wars of colonial liberation Asians would be fighting against both the Allies and Japan. Most Trotskyists spent the war years trying to unravel these strands so they could deal with them separately. Shachtman, instead of dealing with the war piecemeal, tried to do what communists had done in the First World War, characterized the war as a whole. His attitude toward the Second World War owed much to Lenin's earlier analysis. Although working people's hatred of fascism made this war seem different, he said that it was at bottom, quote, a direct continuation of the war of 1914 to 1918, end quote. Socialist attitudes towards it should be a continuation of Lenin's fight against the war of 1914 to 18. Lenin had opposed any socialist complicity in the First World War so that socialists could lead a potentially revolutionary movement for peace. Lenin had opposed the war as a whole. Lenin even opposed Serbia's war of self-defense against Austria in 1914. However, Iran, the Austrian attack was, Lenin argued, Serbian resistance was a tool of Russian imperial ambitions in the Balkans. Shachtman looked at the Second World War with the same basic concerns as Lenin and made the same basic choices. Shachtman resisted any tactic that would lead socialists to support German, British, or U.S. imperialism, even critically or indirectly. The chief issue of the war was, quote, who is going to get the major share of the swag, end quote. The New International said, quote, the blood stains of all their hands alike. Quote, the blood stains all of their hands alike, end quote. From the onset of the war, the New International resisted any attempt to portray it as a conflict between the, quote, democratic West, end quote, and some alien force. Quote, Hitler is not Attila, ... The Nazis are neither barbarians from the north nor infidels from the south. The Nazis are flesh of Europe's flesh and bone of Europe's bone. The Nazis represent a stage in the development of capitalist society, the epoch of its decay, end quote. Shachtman. In short, all the capitalist armies represented barbarism. Shachtman believed in the possibility of a third force arising, a force for civilization that could defeat Nazism without upholding U.S. or any other capitalism. The idea of a third force, a, quote, third camp, end quote, was common to all Trotskyists when the Second World War broke out. But Shachtman put the, quote, third camp, at, quote, unquote, at the center of all his arguments, while the Trotskyists focused on a different slogan, the, quote, unconditional defense of the USSR, end quote. With the Soviet invasion of Poland, the two slogans conflicted for the first time. The third camp in Poland, the camp of revolutionary opposition to all the imperial powers, could only be an independent Polish resistance. Whatever independent Polish resistance there was, actual or potential, the Soviet Union in alliance with Germany was at war with. Shachtman decided the Soviet Union could not be defended in this war. Shachtman denied that the international working class had more to gain from a Soviet victory than from a German, British, or French victory. Once Shachtman staked out this position, Shachtman came into conflict with Trotsky, ended his alliance with Jim Cannon, and formed a new current within international Trotskyism. In the course of a fierce debate over the war in the Socialist Workers Party from September 1939 to April 1940, Shachtman unearthed and sharpened differences with Cannon, half buried since the early 1930s, about Marxism as a way of thinking and organizing. Like Cannon, Shachtman's Marxism was intransigently internationalist, including a commitment to building the Fourth International, and held its adherence to a high standard of political education and activity. But the Marxism Shachtman argued for was a body of thought still expanding and developing, being continually reshaped through constant discussion both inside the Marxist movement and with working people outside it. Shachtman wanted to add innovations to this body of thought, beginning with a new look at the Soviet Union. Shachtman could not accept Cannon's emphasis on preserving unchanged the substance of what Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky had handed down. As Cannon's orthodoxy won support from a majority of the Socialist Workers' Party, Shachtman fought for the right to present his own ideas to a broader public, first through the Trotskyist publications, then through an independent publication that he demanded the right to publish. In response, Cannon insisted that the Revolutionary Party must have one clear public voice, the voice of the majority. In April 1940, Shachtman left the Socialist Workers' Party and founded his own Workers' Party. Left the party is not an apt term. In April 1940, Shachtman left the Socialist Workers' Party and founded and created his own Workers' Party on the basis of his own conceptions. But both before he created the Workers' Party and afterwards, Shachtman had to defend his open version of Marxism from another side, against radicals who challenged basic Marxist axioms. In early 1939 and again in 1940 to 41, Shachtman wrote at length to uphold a core set of Marxist ideas that were still central to Shachtman's worldview. Shachtman defended the heritage of the Russian Revolution and a Marxist understanding of Stalinism and fascism. Shachtman continued, in a critical and democratic spirit, to try to adapt Leninism to the United States. In the process, Shachtman attacked leading radical intellectuals such as Sidney Hook, Max Eastman, Dwight MacDonald, and his former ally James Burnham. Shachtman set out to weld his followers into a strong, cohesive force by following the, quote, really best traditions of the Marxist movement, end quote, of pre-First World War Germany and Russia. Shachtman renounced the dogmatic and conservative habits Trotskyists had picked up in the Communist International of the 1920s, but defended the idea of a disciplined activist organization. Shachtman succeeded in giving the Workers' Party the identity Shachtman wanted, a Trotskyist identity, but a Trotskyist identity that stressed the critical and democratic strains within Trotskyism and pushed the group outward toward the working class. Shachtman took a group consisting largely of students and unemployed ex-students and helped turn them into organizers. In the early 1940s, Shachtman saw the new Workers' Party as the U.S. Revolutionary Party, the force that would win workers away from capitalist ideas and organize them to take power. It was the radical movement's, quote, repository of socialist consciousness, end quote, and, quote, organized memory, end quote, which joined, quote, yesterday with today, end quote, and, quote, today with tomorrow, end quote. As Shachtman mourned the loss of Trotsky's friendship, made permanent by Trotsky's assassination in August 1940, Shachtman said that he was doing what had to be done in the United States to build Trotsky's International. All his independent thoughts that had been germinating through the 1930s reached fruition in the Workers' Party's, quote, Third Camp, end quote, Marxism in the early and mid-1940s. The most enduring aspect of Shachtman's evolving Third Camp Marxism was his theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism in the USSR, end quote. A theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, in the USSR, which Shachtman laid out for the first time in November 1940. The theory justified his abandonment of unconditional loyalty to the USSR. It borrowed not only its phraseology, but much of its content from the theory James Burnham and Joe Carter came up with in 1938. Like Carter and Burnham, Shachtman said that there can be no socialism and no workers' state without some form of working-class political power. Like Carter and Burnham, Shachtman rejected Trotsky's characterization of the USSR as a workers' state. Like Carter and Burnham, Shachtman said the Soviet state had become an instrument of a new bureaucratic ruling class. But Shachtman did not turn his back completely on the Soviet experiment and dismiss it as a failure. By synthesizing some of Carter's and Burnham's insights with some of Trotsky's, Shachtman continued to maintain that the Russian Revolution had not yet been entirely undone. Like Trotsky, he still said that collective property in the Soviet Union, though bureaucratically mismanaged, was an advance over capitalism, a necessary condition for the dramatic economic growth of the 1930s, and a sign that the world had entered an epoch of transition towards socialism. The Soviet Union's bureaucratic class relations were in contradiction with its collectivist property forms, Shachtman said. Socialists should save Soviet collectivism by overthrowing the bureaucracy and reestablishing the workers' democracy of the revolution's first months. The Workers' Party spent the spring and summer of 1941 immersed in debates over Shachtman's new theory. A few of its members still upheld Trotsky's position that the USSR is a workers' state. More supported Joe Carter or C.L.R. James, whose alternative theories deny that there was anything positive remaining in the USSR from the Russian Revolution. In the midst of these debates, in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Shachtman disconcerted his supporters in the Workers' Party and heartened his critics by refusing, contrary to his theory's apparent implications, to give any kind of support to the Soviet Union's defense. Shachtman got a formal majority of his organization to endorse his theory, and an overwhelming majority supported his, quote, plague in all their houses, end quote, attitude towards the war. The Workers' Party had closed ranks by the time the United States entered the war in December 1941. Its members united in rejecting not only Nazism but the U.S. fight for world supremacy, and in upholding Marxism. They defined an internationalist and in upholding a Marxism they defined as internationalist but completely independent of Soviet communism. I don't know if he's going to emphasize this or not, but very important, is to note that the group around Shachtman, the Workers' Party, did not change their course when the United States became an ally of the Soviet Union in World War II. They did not loosen their rejection of unconditional defense of the Soviet Union. The Nazi-Soviet pact and the Soviet intervention in Poland took communists outside the USSR completely by surprise. They had anticipated none of these events and were at a loss to respond to them. Before the German-Soviet pact, U.S. Communist leader Earl Browder said, quote, "There is as much chance of Russo-German agreement as of Earl Browder being elected president of the Chamber of Commerce," end quote. As late as the 11th of September, with Soviet troops poised to invade, Browder urged the U.S. government to aid Poland. Only a cable from Moscow installed a new party line. That Britain, France, and Poland were at least as responsible for the war as Germany, probably more. As Shachtman had predicted a year before, communists discovered once more, quote, that the Versailles Peace Treaty and the status quo are viciously reactionary and bourgeois democracy a hoax and a snare, end quote. Thousands of the Communist Party's members left it in protest, but a few of its major leaders resigned or even demurred. Trotskyists, by contrast, who had foreseen almost everything, were racked by debates. Prediction is one thing in politics, action is another. Trotskyists have been happily united behind Trotsky's prediction of a deal between Hitler and Stalin. They were divided about what to do about the Soviet attack on Poland. Some wanted to support it, some to oppose it, some to take no position. They were divided again about how to respond to the Soviet attack on Finland in November 1939. Shachtman emerged in these debates as the leader of a distinctive current with a distinctive attitude toward the war. The fault lines in the Trotskyist ranks took time to crack open. In the first days of the German-Soviet pact, the Socialist Workers Party was united in condemning it. On the 22nd of August 1939, the day before the pact was signed, Shachtman successfully pushed the political committee for a strong campaign against it. In his speech on the 25th of August, Shachtman said, quote, "Stalin has given Hitler the go-ahead signal, the green light, to invade Poland," end quote. Shachtman made the same argument at length in a series of articles in The Socialist Appeal, which were to be collected into a party pamphlet. Quote, "The mask is off, at last," end quote, Shachtman and Burnham said in the New International. Quote, "The blood-stained, monstrous face of Stalinism exposed, now for the whole world to see," end quote. On the 1st of September, German troops invaded Poland, and the Second World War began. When Soviet troops marched into Poland in mid-September, Shachtman and Burnham proposed to denounce Stalin for having joined in Hitler's invasion. Now many Socialist Workers' Party leaders hesitated to back Shachtman's stand. The fact that Hitler and Stalin had carved up Poland in advance was still a secret. Thousands of Polish Jews were glad enough of Soviet intervention and fled from German-occupied Poland to Soviet-occupied Poland. Thousands of Polish Jews were glad enough to have Soviet intervention and fled from the German-occupied Poland to Soviet-occupied Poland. Many Ukrainian Belarusian peasants were willing to be incorporated into the Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Belorussia if the alternative was German occupation. See right here, like, this is a total mistelling of the. This is a very problematic paragraph here. The first thing to notice is that this is not like Soviet occupation versus Nazi occupation, right? This is a collaborative joint effort to carve up Poland. The idea that it was like that this Nazi-Soviet pact and the land grabs and the expansion that the Nazi-Soviet pact had wrapped in it was somehow good for Jews or something like that, or good for Belarusians, or good for Ukrainians, is to misunderstand entirely the nature of this pact. These aren't warring parties. It's not like Soviet Union is expanding and in antagonism to the Nazi expansion, but in cooperation with it. Al Goldman proposed to support the Soviet intervention as a way of, quote, preventing Hitler from getting control of all of Poland, end quote, and, quote, defending the Soviet Union against Hitler, end quote. Cannon reserved judgment on it in order to wait for Trotsky's opinion. The party leadership reaffirmed Trotskyist basic analysis of the Soviet state in their call for an independent Soviet Ukraine, but said nothing about the invasion. Only when Trotsky had announced it did U.S. Trotskyists fall in line behind him. Shachtman was too sure of his own opinion to wait to hear Trotsky's. Shachtman was sure that Stalin had struck a deal with Hitler to expand his dictatorship in the East in return for Hitler expanding his dictatorship in the West. Shachtman dismissed Cannon's and Goldman's failure to see the deal as an inability, quote, to believe their own eyes, end quote. Shachtman had begun to have doubts about the orthodox Trotskyist line on the Soviet state, Shachtman said later, but in any event, the orthodox line did not tell Trotskyists what they should do. Many party members shared Shachtman's sense of frustration. Trotskyist leaders' hesitation stemmed from disorientation. Trotskyist leaders had been united before the invasion in the assumption that Stalinism would compromise with capitalist states, convive with them, surrender to them, but not confront them head-on. Stalinism might stumblingly defend the conquest of the revolution, but never extend them. Its foreign policy was bound to be timid, conservative, even cowardly. In his first statement on the German-Soviet pact, 2 weeks before Soviet troops invaded Poland, Trotsky still stressed, quote, "I never predicted that Stalin would conclude an aggressive pact with Hitler," end quote. Yet Stalin did act aggressively, not only in Poland but elsewhere, not only at Hitler's initiative, but at his own. First, Stalin forced the Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to accept the presence of Soviet troops in their territory. Then he presented an ultimatum to Finland demanding the cession of strategic positions along the Soviet-Finnish frontier. When Finland rejected Stalin's demands at the end of November 1939, the Soviet army attacked. Shachtman said later, quote, "Every possibility is foreseen except the one that actually came about," end quote. Shachtman was, quote, "thinking on the run," end quote, himself. But Shachtman was clear from the start that the Soviet invasion of Poland was wrong and that Trotskyists had to put forward an alternative policy to Stalin's. Shachtman's alternative to Stalin's deal was the, quote, "revolutionary defense of Poland," end quote. Trotskyists should call on Poles to, quote, "rise in revolutionary struggle and with their own armed forces drive out the oppressors of the people, Hitler in one half of the country and the Stalin bureaucracy in the other," end quote. They should tell Polish and Ukrainian workers to fight against the Soviet army in order to create an independent socialist Poland and an independent socialist Ukraine. Shachtman rejected any support to the Polish government, but Shachtman's strategy meant resisting Stalinism in eastern Poland before it was firmly established, before the existing Polish army and state were completely destroyed. Shachtman's stand could not be squared with the, quote, "unconditional defense of the USSR," end quote. Trotskyists have never interpreted, quote, "defense," end quote, to mean that they would fight for the Soviet Union only if another country attacked first. They had said that they supported Soviet victory in any Soviet war against a capitalist state. Now that the Soviet army was acting as a tool of German imperialism and Stalin's own ambitions, Shachtman said, Trotskyists should make clear that they would not fight for the Soviet Union in this war. Instead, they should call on Soviet soldiers to mutiny in support of Polish revolutionary forces. Quote, "Our slogan of unconditional defense of the Soviet Union has been proved by events by reality to be false and misleading, to be harmful," end quote, Shachtman argued. Quote, "It must be abandoned," end quote. It had rested on an assumption that whenever the Soviet army fought against a capitalist army, it was fighting a progressive war. Shachtman now denied this assumption. The nationalized economy had little to do with war in the Soviet Union. Quote, "Where the political superstructure, parenthesis, the Stalinist state apparatus, end parenthesis, has acquired a degree and type of independence from its social basis without parallel, at least in modern times," end quote, he said. Quote, "It is not the nationalized economy that goes to war. It is not the economy that decides when the war should be declared or started, or against whom the war should be directed, how the war should be conducted. Nor does the working class make these decisions, either directly or indirectly, for it is gagged and fettered and straitjacketed. The decisions and directions of the war are entirely in the hands of the bureaucracy. which, bracket, has, end bracket, its own social, economic, and political interests, end quote. Since the aims of Stalin's war were the expansion of the bureaucracy's power, and its consequences were to demoralize and disorganize the working class, the war was reactionary. Shachtman was ready to call the Soviet invasion, quote, imperialist, unquote. Lenin had defined imperialism as a consequence of a specific phase of capitalist development, monopoly capitalism, that had begun in the 1870s to the 1880s. But Marxists had kept on using the word in a looser way to refer to many other ruling classes that had tried to expand their power at the expense of other states, from the ancient Egyptians to the modern Ottomans. I think that's even true of Lenin. Shachtman felt that it applied now to the Soviet bureaucracy. Right after the invasion, Shachtman said that the bureaucracy was, quote, playing with grandiose ideas of imitating the, quote, successes, end quote, of Hitler, end quote. Shachtman quoted Trotsky's own insistence that the Soviet economy's contradictions could not be solved within its borders. To resolve these contradictions in its own way, Shachtman and others said, the bureaucracy was now seeking, quote, new territories, new wealth, new privileges, new power, new resources of raw material, new trade facilities, new sources of labor power, end quote. Cannon refused to accept Shachtman's innovations. Quote, we always said the moment of danger will find the Fourth Internationalists at their posts defending the conquest of the Great Revolution, end quote, Cannon said. Quote, now that the hour of danger is at hand, now that the long-awaited war is actually knocking at the door, it would be strange that the Fourth International should renege on its oft-repeated pledge, end quote. Cannon urged people to, quote, see the Soviet Union for what the Soviet Union is, a gigantic labor organization that has conquered 1/6 of the Earth's surface, end quote. Cannon's battle cry was, quote, our program, shall not be changed, end quote. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland, the Socialist Workers Party, under Cannon's leadership, urged Soviet Trotskyists to be, quote, the best soldiers in the Red Army, end quote, even as the party condemned the invasion and called for Soviet withdrawal. Trotsky was first disturbed, then suspicious, then incensed by Shachtman's arguments. Trotsky never said in so many words whether Trotskyists should fight for the Soviet army against the Polish army in an intervention that they thought was wrong. But he could not accept an attitude of indifference to Soviet victory or defeat. Trotsky always considered the bureaucracy's expansionist tendency to be a minor factor, far less important than the basic antagonism between the worker state and the surrounding capitalist states. Shachtman and his allies felt that the emphasis led Trotsky astray in his predictions about the Finnish War. Trotsky predicted that Stalin would compromise with Finland rather than go to war. Trotsky was wrong. Trotsky predicted that as Soviet troops advanced, Soviet troops would begin expropriating Finnish capitalists. He was wrong. Trotsky had believed so firmly that the civil war would begin in Finland that he had spoken of the imaginary civil war as a fact. In short, Trotsky had argued that Stalin would stay on the defensive whenever possible, but if Stalin went on the offensive, the socialist cause would benefit. In fact, Stalin went on the offensive against both Poland and Finland, and the socialist cause was set back. Trotsky disputed Shachtman's idea that Trotskyists had a practical alternative to offer. Obviously, the best outcome would be if the working class had its own army to fight both Hitler and Stalin, Trotsky said. But it did not. It therefore had a choice of two evils, and Stalin's army was a lesser evil than Hitler's. Goldman defended Trotsky's argument in its crudest form when he said, quote, between the slavery of a degenerated workers' state and the slavery of capitalism, we prefer the slavery of a degenerated workers' state, end quote. Goldman said that the nationalized property in the Soviet Union was the only concrete thing the international working class had left, and he would not trade it in for, quote, some abstractions of the world revolution, end quote. Shachtman's followers, horrified, hissed Goldman loudly. Shachtman knew that the revolutionary movement was weak. At the same time that he was suggesting slogans for Polish revolutionaries, he was appealing for aid to Polish Trotskyists who had fled to Lithuania and were begging to be gotten out of. He was appealing for aid to Polish Trotskyists who had fled to Lithuania and were begging to be gotten out while there was still time. But Shachtman and his allies refused to dismiss the hope for revolution as, quote, some abstraction, end quote. Quote, the forces of the Third Camp are already at hand, scattered, demoralized, without program or perspective. The problem is to bring them together, to infuse them with morale, to supply them with a program and perspective, ... The Third Camp, however embryonic or weak, must orient itself, at the very outset, towards a decisive struggle not only against world imperialism, but also against the Stalinist reaction, end quote. Shachtman. Even when Shachtman acknowledged the danger of Allied intervention against the Soviet Union in the Finnish War, Shachtman would not promise to support the Soviet Union against such an attack. The fact that the Soviet Union was fighting for territorial aggrandizement and not in defense of nationalized property would not be changed simply by Anglo-French intervention, he said. Only if the war were transformed into a war, quote, whose aim was to restore capitalism in Russia, end quote, should Trotskyists support the USSR. One of the most important questions raised in the debate was how to assess Soviet economic policy in the western Ukraine and Belarusian territories the Soviet Union had annexed. Stalin extended to these territories the same policies he had been carrying out in the rest of the Soviet Union. Stalin collectivized agriculture and nationalized industry. Shachtman felt driven to deny that anything progressive had resulted from the invasion. The collectivizations and nationalizations were progressive, Shachtman argued, but the Soviet intervention had nothing to do with them. Working people had already been rising up and taking over factories and farms before the Soviet Union intervened, so the intervention had only contained the economic transformation within a bureaucratic straitjacket. As evidence that the Soviet bureaucracy did not want to abolish capitalism outside the Soviet Union, Shachtman pointed to the Baltic republics that the Soviet army had occupied without changing their societies. Shachtman later admitted that he had been wrong. In fact, the Soviet army did annex the Baltic states and restructure their economies on the Soviet model, starting in June 1940, only a few months after Shachtman made his argument. During the Soviet-Finnish War, Shachtman changed his position, promising to support any nationalizations the Soviet army carried out. But bound up with Shachtman's 1939 mistake was an important insight, an insight that flatly contradicted what Trotsky was saying about the Polish nationalizations. Trotsky could not imagine that the nationalizations were taking place without any popular initiative. Trotsky insisted that Stalin's invasion had only given a, quote, bureaucratic impulse, end quote, to a revolutionary mass movement, even if Stalin was able to make sure that the movement was, quote, semi-stifled, end quote. The expropriations were impossible without some kind of appeal to independent working-class action, he argued. As long as there was any popular movement, Trotsky believed that his followers could and should find a way to take part in it. Shachtman agreed with Trotsky that there had been factory occupations and land occupations in eastern Poland before Soviet troops arrived. But he understood something that Trotsky did not. Once Soviet troops were there, the only movement that was permitted was the official movement. Any activity that Stalin's government allowed was so controlled and orchestrated that in the last analysis it was no more than a propaganda exercise. The nationalizations had been carried out by military force and administrative fiat. In this kind of nationalization, Shachtman argued, there was no significant advance towards socialism. What counted was not nationalization, but the working people's ability to run their own country. Quote, the bureaucratic proletarian revolution, that I do not know of, and I do not believe in it, end quote, Shachtman said. No force but the working class can free the working class, quote, not even for a day, end quote. This insight gave Shachtman his answer to Cannon's most popular argument, the analogy between the Soviet Union under Stalin and a gangster-controlled trade union. The Socialist Workers Party's rank-and-file members and unions responded to the argument that however bad the union leadership, they still had to defend the union. But Shachtman and his group pointed out that the whole analogy was flawed. Trotskyists had always urged even corrupt union leaders to expand their unions by, quote, organizing the unorganized, end quote. Trotskyists did not urge Stalin to expand the Soviet Union by, quote, revolutionizing the unrevolutionized, end quote, because they did not equate revolution with conquest by a foreign bureaucracy. Bureaucracy in a trade union was an obstacle to expansion, but did not negate the value of expansion. Bureaucracy in the Soviet Union made the aggrandizement of the state a defeat rather than a victory. The 1939-40 controversy in the Socialist Workers Party did not hinge on Poland, Finland, and the Soviet Union. Nobody in the Socialist Workers Party argued in 1939-40 that a split could be justified merely by Shachtman's and Cannon's differences over the Soviet Union. But their different conceptions of Marxism convinced their followers that they could not live together in the same organization. Different approaches to Marxist theory and Marxist method found immediate expression in sharp disagreements about how socialists should discuss and decide disputed issues and what it meant for a socialist organization to function democratically. This, quote, organizational question, end quote, directly precipitated Shachtman's break with the Socialist Workers' Party. Shachtman blamed Cannon for the stagnation of the Socialist Workers' Party, which had lost at least 300 members between the beginning of 1938 and the end of 1939. Shachtman had already attacked Cannon during the July 1939 convention for resisting Shachtman's efforts to galvanize the group. There were objective reasons for Trotskyist losses that are probably more important than anything Cannon did. Leftists were demoralized by their defeat in the Spanish War. The Depression had deepened after Roosevelt's re-election. The CIO was faltering. But Shachtman also said, that Cannon cared too much about remaining doctrinally safe and preserving his little apparatus to reach out boldly to people in the United States. Right or wrong, Shachtman was able to capitalize on the widespread discontent in the Socialist Workers' Party at the group's stagnation in order to win sympathy for his criticism of Cannon's, quote, regime, end quote. Footnote. Cannon discounted the discontent in the Socialist Workers' Party by raising the old charge that malcontents were middle-class lightweights opposed by the real Trotskyist workers. Shachtman eventually counted 132 trade unionists among his 329 solid supporters. But as in 1931-33, most of them were New Yorkers and/or youth, and most of the longtime trade unionists supported Cannon. The question was whether trade unionist support necessarily made Cannon right. Shachtman denied that there was a direct correspondence in the short run between internal factional divides and class struggle in the outside world. Shachtman argued that Cannon's, quote, demagoguery, end quote, about the working class, like Stalin's in the 1920s, said, quote, to the rank and file, ... quote, no thinking. Those at the top have more brains than you, end quote, end quote. End footnote. From the beginning of 1939-40 controversy on the Soviet intervention in Poland, Shachtman said that the whole Socialist Workers' Party would have to discuss the issues he was raising. Trotsky agreed, quote, when these deviations are bearing their first fruits, end quote, Trotsky told Cannon, one should not be, quote, very intransigent and impatient, end quote. Cannon agreed to have an open discussion bulletin in membership meetings to thrash out the dispute, but he took part in the discussion with distaste. Quote, in debating with Shachtman, I crawl my belly through the mud for the sake of the Fourth International, end quote, Cannon told Trotsky. In hindsight, the 1939-40 debate looks like a high point for internal democracy in the Socialist Workers' Party. In New York, the home of the party's national office and many of its branches, the debate took place in citywide membership meetings that were like gladiatorial contests in Colosseum. 100 or more people might attend. Sometimes Cannon and Shachtman would each speak for an hour. The assembled members would speak for a couple of hours. Then Shachtman and Cannon would each have an hour for rebuttal. Even young Shachtman supporter Leo Seidlitz was impressed by the other side's speeches, as well as his own side's, quote, Cannon was no slouch, end quote, he remembered. Al Glotzer remembered, quote, There was only one person who could handle Jim. That was Max, end quote. Irving Kristol said years later that he had never heard the equal of those speeches. The audience would not head home until the early hours of the morning. Although the Trotskyist 1939-40 debate among themselves was relatively democratic, Shachtman and Cannon disagreed on what was the democratic way for the Trotskyists to face the public. The most important organizational issue raised in the controversy was whether a major internal discussion like this one could or should be confined inside the organization. On this issue, the Leninist tradition was ambiguous. In Lenin's What is to be Done of 1902, Lenin had argued that socialist consciousness had to be brought to the working class, quote, from the outside, end quote. In part, Lenin meant that workers needed more information and ideas than they could get from union organizing or strikes, but Lenin also meant that workers could not develop correct socialist ideas on their own and needed to get socialism from intellectuals who understood social science. Stalin used this argument as proof that the party was the repository of truth, and the masses were destined to be instructed and led by it. Lenin had usually not followed this logic. Lenin had used the argument in 1902 only as a, quote, polemical exaggeration, end quote, Shachtman said. In the midst of the big working-class radicalizations of 1905 and 1917, Lenin insisted that socialist ideas had meaning only as expressions of mass struggles and had to be shaped, refined, and corrected by living movements. He described the working class as, quote, instinctively, spontaneously, end quote, revolutionary, and called for Bolshevik groups to, quote, let the fresh spirit of young revolutionary Russia pour in through them, end quote, and become, quote, less rigid, more, quote, free, end quote, and more, quote, loose, end quote, end quote. Only when the Russian working class was decimated and made apathetic by the bloody civil war of 1918-21 did Lenin speak again as if the party could lead and think without intimate contact with those living movements. In 1939-40, Cannon felt profoundly distrustful of U.S. public opinion. The country was disappointed by the New Deal's failures, disillusioned by the German-Soviet pact. It was giving up its earlier sympathy for the Soviet Union and swinging to the right. The working class, too, was affected by this trend. Cannon's instinctive response was to fight back against the pressure of public opinion. Cannon wanted the Socialist Workers Party to handle its business, quote, without the intervention of the general public, end quote. Cannon clung to Trotsky's theories, saying that preserving them intact was one of the Trotskyists' most important tasks. Shachtman reacted differently. After hard years of trying to get workers and radicals to hear what was wrong with the Soviet Union, Shachtman was glad that the party could at last get a wider hearing for its criticisms. He was also confident that the more open the party was to the outside world, the less likely it would be to uphold Cannon and, quote, unconditional defense of the unconditional defense of the USSR, end quote. Shachtman became a champion of the democratic open Leninism of 1905 and 1917 when the Bolsheviks had, quote, a richer and more democratic internal life than do most parties today, end quote. Accusing Cannon of a, quote, spirit of Stalinist monolithism, parenthesis, palmed off as Bolshevik centralism, end parenthesis, end quote. Shachtman and his allies called for public debate. Cannon fought for a Leninist tradition more like the one shaped in the experience of the Communist International, which the Third Campists would describe as Zinovieist. In principle, Trotsky had some sympathy for Shachtman on this issue. Quote, a developing and alive party must represent to a certain extent the different tendencies, disquietudes, and I repeat, even the confusion in the vanguard of the working class, end quote, Trotsky told Cannon before the Socialist Workers Party was formed. Quote, I believe that the next period, the emphasis must be on the democracy, not on the centralism, end quote. But as the fight went on, Trotsky became convinced that Shachtman cared less about openness to the working class than openness to middle-class intellectuals. Trotsky decided that the minority had to be told, quote, you must wait for the verdict of the party and not appeal before the verdict is pronounced to the democratic patriotic judges, end quote, Trotsky. The concrete issue the two factions fought about was whether the internal party discussion should spill over into the party press. Cannon was willing to have the strictly theoretical issues discussed in the New International, which was meant for a sophisticated audience. Even there, however, Cannon imposed conditions so restrictive that the opposition chafed bitterly under them. Cannon was determined that the debate stay out of the socialist appeal, which was meant to reach the broadest possible audience. In Cannon's mind, the party, in keeping with its established positions, had decided to defend the Soviet army in Poland and Finland. The appeal could carry out that decision, not debate it. Shachtman disagreed. The working class should not be the, quote, passive recipient of programs, quote, finished, end quote, inside of locked party laboratories, end quote, Shachtman said later. The party should allow workers outside the party's ranks to hear and judge the arguments. Joe Carter pointed out that Lenin had taken his famous, quote, April Theses, end quote, calling for socialist revolution in Russia, to the public in 1917, when most Bolshevik leaders disagreed with Lenin. The pressure of working class opinion helped Lenin win the Bolsheviks to his position. Without openness between the working class and the Bolshevik party, there might never have been a Russian Revolution. By early December 1939, the minority was pressing the political committee to allow discussion articles in the Socialist Appeal. In January and February 1940, the debate shifted to the contents of the New International. This February issue turned out to be one long attack on Shachtman without a word in his defense. Together with the appeal's barely veiled attacks on, quote, middle-class Democrats, end quote, who, quote, howl about, quote, Stalinist imperialism, end quote, the February New International convinced Shachtman that the Socialist Workers Party press would never do his side of the debate justice. At a national conference in Cleveland at the end of February 1940, Shachtman's faction announced that regardless of who won at the convention, it would issue its own independent publication to reach people outside the party. Shachtman had taken a big step towards breaking with Trotsky and Cannon. The strain showed. A majority observer in Cleveland said that Shachtman looked, quote, thin, worried, wizened, and bitter, end quote. The minority spent a frenetic weekend during the party convention on the 5th to 8th of April. During the day, minority delegates argued with the majority. At night, they attended their own conference. They were rallied and cut off from the majority by Shachtman's slashing polemics. He appealed to the majority, quote, you are wrong, horribly wrong, tragically wrong, but not irretrievably wrong. Do not force the split, and tomorrow our paths may converge again. End quote. As Goldman moved to cut off Shachtman's report, Shachtman pleaded, quote, you would not expel me before letting me conclude the speech, end quote. He repeated the minority's pledge to publish its own paper, whatever the convention decided. With neither side having backed down, the split was a foregone conclusion. On the 16th of April, Cannon presented the new political committee with a motion pledging each member to abide by the convention decisions. When Shachtman and his allies refused to vote on it, they were suspended from membership on the spot. Shachtman said later, quote, Cannon took a look at his watch, turned to his friends, and said, quote, 3 minutes, end quote. He was proud of the fact that the whole split had taken only 3 minutes to carry through, end quote. 1 second. Sorry, I had to put on some lotion real quick. The mosquitoes were being difficult. Shachtman had criticized the Socialist Workers Party's democracy as inadequate and the Socialist Workers Party's Marxism as petrified. Now Shachtman would have to show and practice the kind of democracy and Marxism he believed in. Shachtman took his faction almost intact into his new Workers' Party. Shachtman also worked to keep the political rethinking that he had unleashed within bounds. He was determined that his new organization should be Marxist. Quote, "Our movement is based precisely on Marxian theory, the nature of capitalist society, the role of the working class, the proletarian revolution, and so forth," end quote, Shachtman said. Marxism founded the prospects for socialism not on the understanding that capitalism was the result of historical forces and was thrown into depressions and wars for historical reasons. Excuse me. I read that wrong. Marxism founded the prospects for socialism not merely on the belief that a socialist society would be a better society, but on the understanding that capitalism was the result of historical forces and was thrown into depressions and wars for historical reasons. Marxism also offered a way out of these crises, reliance on labor's conflicts with capital, which was an inevitable, endlessly resurgent feature of capitalism. Marxism gave an understanding of politics as the only arena where class conflicts could be resolved, through the overthrow of capitalist political power and its replacement by working class political power. Without Marxism, Shachtman said, quote, "we would have no reason to exist as a party," end quote. Many people who had turned to Marxism in the early 1930s were rejecting Marxism by the decade's end. The rejection was voiced most articulately by radical intellectuals, particularly some of the intellectuals who had worked with Shachtman to expose the Moscow purge trials. Shachtman had always been at ease with intellectuals and had worked well with the few, particularly around the Partisan Review, who joined in the campaign against the trials. But his disgust at the many radical intellectuals around the nation and the New Republic, who had defended the Soviet regime, had outlasted the purges. Now it colored his relations with independent intellectuals he had worked with, as many of them turned against Trotskyism in the last months before the Second World War. The years 1939 and 1940 were ones of hopelessness and renunciations for many leftists, years that provided a foretaste of post-war McCarthyism. The mood of the country was turning against radicals. By the 1940s, the Smith Act would criminalize advocacy of revolution, and the Voorhis Act would outlaw any ties to the Communist International or Fourth International. Under these pressures, many intellectuals who had used Trotsky's help to cast off their communist sympathies moved on toward social democratic, liberal, or right-wing politics. Many would join in the anti-communist crusade of the 1950s. Shachtman imagined that he could hear these intellectuals, quote, Shachtman imagined that he could hear these intellectuals' teeth, quote, chattering with fright in the growing totalitarian darkness, end quote, as they fell back on, quote, preserving a rotted capitalist order by, quote, democratic, end quote, means, end quote. Their failure to take part in the day-to-day work of building the socialist movement, he said, was depriving their thinking of, quote, richness and reality and fruitfulness and purpose, end quote. Shachtman faced intellectual challenges to his brand of Marxism in 1939 to 41 from socialists such as Max Eastman, Sidney Hook, and Dwight MacDonald, young followers such as Philip Selznick, Irving Kristol, and Seymour Martin Lipset, and most shockingly, his ally and fellow editor, James Burnham. Shachtman responded to these challenges by reaffirming his Marxist identity and writing it into the Workers' Party's basic documents. In these debates, he rejected his adversaries' portrayal of Marxism as a closed, undemocratic system. He believed that Marxists had to be independent, critical-minded thinkers. He pledged the Workers' Party to complete freedom of discussion in the, quote, undogmatic spirit that animated the great revolutionary thinkers after Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, Mering, and their like, end quote. A spirit that welcomed vigorous disagreements. He kept the Workers' Party's discussion bulletins and even the New International open to dissenters, acknowledging the, quote, terrible discreditment of the very name of socialism, end quote, by Stalinism. He wanted the Workers' Party to approach with sympathy working people who were questioning the Marxist tradition. But he showed neither sympathy nor restraint toward Eastman, Hook, MacDonald, or Burnham, whom he saw as simple renegades. Instead, he devoted his energies to defending his core beliefs, the original grassroots democracy of the Russian Soviets and the Bolshevik Party, fascism as a manifestation of capitalism's deep crisis and inherent violence, and the need for an activist, disciplined revolutionary party and international. Eastman, who had defended Trotsky in the U.S. press years before Shachtman became a Trotskyist, and Hook, a philosopher and one-time Mustite, began in 1938 to argue that Trotsky himself was responsible for the beginnings of Stalinism, particularly through his willingness to ban opposition parties. At about the same time, Socialist Workers Party member Dwight MacDonald began criticizing Trotsky's role in suppressing the March 1921 Kronstadt Rebellion. Shachtman and James Burnham responded with a strong defense of Bolshevism and Trotskyism in the January 1939 issue of the New International. Shachtman defended the Bolshevik tradition in large part by interpreting it in his own way, emphasizing the democratic strain within it. He had never understood Marx's, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, to be a rejection of democracy. As early as 1934, Shachtman said that a revolutionary state in the United States would, quote, suppress only those who take up arms against it, end quote. If at any time the Revolutionary Party lost its majority in democratically elected Soviets, he said, quote, the party would submit and seek to convince the Soviets, end quote. Now in 1939, Shachtman and Burnham amplified this commitment. They still argued that in conditions of civil war, the contending forces would be likely to divide into one legal party leading the revolution and counter-revolutionary parties fighting and being fought for force. In Catalonia in 1937, for example, a successful revolution might have required unification of POUM, anarchists, and Trotskyists into a single party. But once the Civil War was won, the Revolutionary Party would develop into, quote, a coalition of many parties, a federated party, and full democratic expression might be given publicly and freely through it, end quote. The federated party might in turn divide into several different parties as new issues arose. Shachtman said flatly in April 1939 that a workers' state, quote, has no right to suppress other working-class organizations for their political views, end quote. He soon drew the corollary that Lenin and Trotsky would have done better to legalize the opposition parties after the Civil War, even in Russia. Quote, it was disastrous to outlaw them in perpetuity, end quote. He said, quote, the right of free speech, press, and assembly, the right to organize, and the right to strike are not less necessary under the dictatorship of the proletariat, but more necessary and more possible, end quote. The Bolsheviks' decision to deny these rights permanently to their opponents helped to make Stalin's bureaucratic dictatorship possible. Quote, proletarian democracy cannot exist for long if it is confined to one faction or one party, end quote, Shachtman concluded. Shachtman reiterated that in the United States, the revolutionary state would guarantee the, quote, widest genuine democracy to all working-class parties and organizations, and even, parenthesis, given, ... no attempt at counter-revolution, end parenthesis, to bourgeois parties, end quote. Similarly, Shachtman and Burnham did not deny that there was a kernel of truth to Dwight MacDonald's assertion that the 1921 Kronstadt rebels, sailors in a naval base near Petrograd led largely by anarchists and populists, had made a legitimate call for the restoration of democratic freedoms revoked by the Bolsheviks, elections by secret ballot, freedom of speech, free trade unions. Shachtman was willing to see the rebels as, quote, unwitting victims, end quote, of unscrupulous anti-Bolsheviks, and the Bolshevik assault on them as, quote, one of the saddest necessities of the Russian Revolution, end quote. Shachtman even admitted the possibility that different policies could have warded off the revolt. Quote, we do not believe in the immaculate conception and evolution of Bolshevism or in its flawlessness or infallibility, end quote, Burnham and Shachtman said. But Shachtman could not stomach MacDonald's insistence that Kronstadt tragedy resulted, quote, from the very nature of Bolshevik political organization, end quote, with its, quote, well-insulated, ... hierarchic bureaucratic party apparatus, end quote. Shachtman and Burnham ridiculed the notion that the Bolsheviks who led the assault on Kronstadt, almost all of whom Stalin would later kill to consolidate his power, were in any way akin to the Stalinist bureaucracy. On the contrary, they said it was the restless peasantry, the social force behind the Kronstadt rebels, that later, quote, found a far more finished and triumphant expression in the victory of Stalinism, end quote. To have overthrown the Bolsheviks in 1921 could only have contributed to destroying the last remnants of Soviet democracy rather than expanding it. In a fight between Bolsheviks and rebels who sought to overthrow them, Shachtman believed that any clear-sighted socialist had to side with the Bolsheviks. Whatever mistakes the Bolsheviks may have made, Shachtman defended them throughout the 1940s as the real representatives of the working class in 1917 and the real defenders of democracy. Bolsheviks were for giving non-Russian peoples their democratic right to self-determination, peasants their democratic rights to the land they farmed, and peace to the Europeans sick of war. Mensheviks were against. The Bolsheviks, together with revolutionary peasant allies, had won a majority in the Soviets, the most democratic institutions then existing in Russia. Shachtman defended even the Bolsheviks' decision in 1918 to dissolve the elected Constituent Assembly, quote, a counter-revolutionary and unrepresentative parliament, end quote. Either the Constituent Assembly or the Soviets had to go, and the Bolsheviks had rightly chosen the Soviets as the more profoundly democratic institution. The more profoundly democratic institutions. Quote, to carry out the program of the democratic revolution, end quote, in 1917 meant breaking with capitalism, Shachtman concluded. The Bolsheviks proved it by carrying out, quote, the most democratic revolution in history, end quote. Intellectuals' rejection of the choice of the Bolsheviks had made, and their insistence that that choice ultimately led to Stalinism, with all its horrors, could only reinforce the message that capitalism was constantly shouting at working people, don't take power. There were two possible explanations for what went wrong in Russia, Shachtman said. One was the intellectualist explanation, at bottom the capitalist explanation, that the attempt by the working class to hold exclusive power resulted in power only for bureaucratic tyrants, quote, the Russian workers lost power because they took power, end quote. The other was Shachtman's explanation, the socialist explanation, quote, the Russian workers lost power because the workers of other countries failed to take power, end quote. The socialist explanation was proved by the actual experience of those few years after 1917, when workers really did rule Russia, a triumphant memory all the more precious since it had not yet been repeated in any other country. In this sense, Shachtman declared, quote, the defense of the Russian Revolution is the defense of Marxism, end quote. Quote, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, end quote, as he had said earlier, quote, and nobody else gave us a picture of the truly breathtaking prospects for human advancement and human dignity which are open to us as soon as capitalism is sent to the rubbish heap, end quote. Quote, it was our revolution. It remains our revolution, our victory and vindication even now when it has been killed, strangled by its imperialists and circulars, deserted by those who should have been its socialist comrades in arms, speared in the back by its Stalinist assassins, dragged in the mud by every backslider and faint heart. It is our revolution. How easy and contemptible it is to draw near the slain Achilles and kick his head now and spit on him, end quote. In MacDonald's writings, as well as in Hooke's and Eastman's, Shachtman saw a dangerous tendency to let anti-Stalinism swell into an overwhelmed opposition to capitalism. Burnham and he called this inflated, distorted anti-Stalinism, quote, Stalinophobia, end quote. They explained that most accounts of Stalinism were, quote, moral rather than scientific or political, end quote. And, quote, less a product of cold social analysis than of mental shock, end quote. Stalinophobia ended by undermining anti-Stalinism, they added. Stalinophobes who could not fight Stalinism effectively because they avoided seeing that it was capitalism, the failure of liberals and reformists to overthrow capitalism, and the encirclement of the Soviet Union by capitalism that gave rise to Stalinism. Shachtman responded with particular sensitivity to complaints about the polemical tone of Trotskyist replies to their critics. Trotsky was not only personally attached to his polemical style. Shachtman responded with particular sensitivity to complaints about the polemical tone of Trotskyist replies to their critics. Shachtman was not only personally attached to his polemical style, but believed that the nature of the criticism justified it. Burnham and Shachtman complained that often, quote, amiable critics of the, quote, Trotskyists, end quote, will say in their most sophisticated and nonchalant manner, quote, you people are just like the Stalinists, fundamentally, end quote, or, quote, didn't you people massacre the Kronstadters, end quote, ... When we reply to such irresponsible or monstrous remarks with only half the sharpness they deserve, our critics become inexpressibly shocked and exclaim, quote, how can you discuss with these Trotskyists? Their tone is insufferable, their manners deplorable, end quote. Such complaints showed only the shallowness of people who had no conception of the life and death issues at stake. Footnote. Shachtman had to make one compromise in order to write this article with Burnham. He had to forego answering Hooke's and Eastman's attacks on Marxist dialectics, since Burnham had rejected dialectics. The article argued that these philosophical issues had no immediate bearing on the political issues at stake. To Shachtman's surprise, Trotsky seemed more upset with this brief passage than he was pleased with the article's main thrust. Quote, "This section on the dialectic is the greatest blow that you personally ... could have delivered to Marxist theory," end quote, Trotsky told him. Shachtman pointed out in response that the famous German communist leader Karl Liebknecht had opposed dialectics too, but that had not stopped Rosa Luxemburg from allying with Liebknecht to oppose the First World War. Shachtman quoted Lenin's comment from another major philosophical dispute, quote, "We must be at loggerheads over philosophy in such a way that ... the Bolsheviks as a faction of the party are not affected by it, end quote. Trotsky said soothingly, quote, "I did not deny in the least the usefulness of the article you and Burnham wrote," end quote. Shachtman was upset when Trotsky revived this philosophical issue as a factional weapon later in 1939-40. He later spoke with resentment about Trotsky's readiness with opponents to, quote, "go back into their political biography," end quote. Yet he understood that Trotsky could not forgive him for disrupting the Fourth International's most solid group. End footnote. Despite Shachtman's polemics against them, MacDonald and other freethinkers found the Socialist Workers Party sided with him in the 1939-40 faction fight, only to face his renewed polemics against them as soon as the Workers' Party was founded. In the fall of 1940, Shachtman attacked MacDonald for adhering to the newly fashionable theory that Nazism and Stalinism were two different forms of the same, quote, totalitarian, end quote, historical force. In Shachtman's eyes, this conflating of fascism and Stalinism denied the centrality of class at the heart of Marxism because it treated the fact that there had been a workers' revolution and nationalization of industry in the Soviet Union, but neither in Germany, as a matter of no fundamental importance. Trotsky and Shachtman had made a thorough Marxist analysis of fascism on the rise in the early 1930s, an analysis that treated class as central. Relying on the widespread knowledge of how Trotsky's predictions had been vindicated, Shachtman did not bother to lay out the whole analysis again in order to refute MacDonald. He valued MacDonald as his last tie to the partisan review circle and kept the New International open to his heterodox articles. But the Workers' Party dropped MacDonald from the New International editorial board and refused to reinstate him, even at the cost of losing him as a contributor and party member. The most unnerving of the intellectual challenges to Shachtman came from James Burnham as the Workers' Party was being founded. By April 1940, Burnham decided that the most important elements of Marxism were, quote, either false or obsolete or meaningless, end quote, and urged Shachtman to leave out the references to Marxism in the new party's founding documents. More forthrightly than any of Shachtman's other antagonists, Burnham blamed Marxism itself for the rise of Stalinism. Shachtman tried to win Burnham back, feeling that he was, quote, torn, end quote, and, quote, assailed by doubts, end quote. But he would not give way on the issues. Even as the split took place, he had Burnham's resignation letter in his pocket. Burnham, quote, spoke very well at our first public meeting, end quote, in early May 1940, Shachtman remembered, but on 21st of May, Burnham made his resignation public. Footnote. Burnham's basic challenge to Shachtman's Marxism was echoed in the spring of 1941 by a group of Workers' Party members gathered around Philip Selznick, a 22-year-old City College graduate. Selznick's group, which included the future sociologist Seymour Martin Lipset and prominent neoconservative to be Irving Kristol, soon left the Workers' Party to join the Socialist Party. Kristol would later credit the New International with teaching him how to, quote, write ... an intellectual discourse, end quote. End footnote. By 1941, Burnham would not only would see not only Stalinism and fascism, but even the New Deal as part of a single bureaucratic menace that required anyone who valued freedom to support capitalism. Shachtman turned his back on his former associate and turned to the task of building his Marxist organization. Shachtman did not want his followers just to affirm their Marxism on paper, but to show Marxism's value in practice. The biggest issue behind the Socialist Workers Party split had been whether a group could have the open public discussion Shachtman called for and still function effectively. Behind Cannon's charges against the minority was the insinuation that Shachtman and his followers were people who only wanted to argue, while Cannon's followers were the activists. Shachtman caricatured this version of, quote, Leninism, end quote. Quote, "We are hard people, we spit bullets, shut up, stop thinking," end quote. Once the Workers' Party was founded, he was eager to prove the worth of his kind of Leninism, to show that his followers too could be working-class leaders. The Workers' Party was, quote, "a democratic organization, but not a loose collection of talkers who do nothing," end quote, Shachtman said. Quote, "Our program today equips us better than any other labor organization in the past to meet the crucial tasks we face. But, no program in the world can transform a group of people into unflinching revolutionaries overnight. For that, 100 tests are required, tests of experience, tests of struggle," end quote. Shachtman. Organizing Shachtmanites for political activity was even harder than getting Shachtmanites to agree on their political identity. Many of them were students or unemployed ex-students. Shachtman had won over not only almost half the members of the Socialist Workers' Party, but the great majority of the Young Trotskyists in the Young People's Socialist League, Fourth International, end parenthesis. These young rebels, quote, "the vanguard of the, quote, locked-out generation," end quote, unquote, were drawn to Shachtman by restlessness born of unemployment, fascination with political debate, the feeling that great events were rushing to meet them, and an urge to fight against the rottenness they saw everywhere. But once they graduated from college to joblessness, they had nowhere to put their radical ideas into practice. Even the Workers' Party's trade unionists had been cut off by the split from the central direction they had been used to in the Socialist Workers' Party. Shachtman set out to send inactive members into unions, movements, and make all members' activity part of a collective project. The Workers' Party's founding convention said that every branch should assign each member a specific task each week so that in each city the group could have an impact in the unions and in politics. The abstract discussions about how to organize died down as Workers' Party members actually started organizing. Through their activity, they shaped a conception of Leninism different from the one they remembered from the Socialist Workers' Party. They began to understand the words, quote, "professional revolutionary," end quote, more broadly than in Cannon's group, where, quote, "a professional revolutionary was somebody paid by the party as a functionary," end quote, remembered Leo Seidlitz, who left school to become a union activist in the early 1940s. Workers' Party's members who took factory jobs in order to put their politics into practice came to be seen as revolutionaries as much as anyone on the political committee. Quote, "You have to do this or that to make a living," end quote. Herman Benson said, quote, "but the basic thing you are in life is a social revolutionary," end quote. As Shachtman worked to make his followers into working-class activists, Shachtman also worked to give them the leadership they needed. Shachtman had a somewhat heterogeneous collection of people from which to create a new leadership. Leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party minority had included a circle of freethinkers such as James Burnham, Joseph Carter, Hal Draper, and Manny Geltman, who were discarding or questioning many Trotskyist ideas. Other leaders of the minority were old allies of Marty Abern's, who opposed Cannon's leadership for so long that they were oppositionists almost by reflex. C.L.R. James came into the Workers' Party with a set of his own ideas and people. Shachtman formed an organizational core for his new group largely by relying on Ernest McKinney's trade union connections and organizing skills and Al Glotzer's loyalty. Glotzer moved back to New York to help build the organization, first as a volunteer and later as a full-time staff member. Glotzer and McKinney worked hard for the Workers' Party and usually let Shachtman set its political direction. Others who disagreed with Shachtman on one issue or another also played important roles. For example, the workers' newspaper, Labor Action, was edited in the early 1940s by more heterodox members such as Geltman and Irving Howe. With no hard and fast factional lines in the group, Shachtman enjoyed uncontested predominance. It was no accident that others on the left called Workers' Party members, quote, Shachtmanites, end quote, though Shachtman, quote, never threw his weight around except intellectually, end quote. Herman Benson remembered the proprietary pride with which Shachtman would say, quote, the Workers' Party, that's mine, end quote. Most of Shachtman's relationships revolved around his organization. Breaking with Cannon was not terribly hard for him, though he said years later that it was, quote, a harsh hour that tore and kept us apart, end quote. Shachtman gradually became friendly again with Glotzer in the early 1940s, although he would tease his friend even about the most sensitive subjects. Geltman remembered Shachtman bringing some pies Edith Harvey had made to the Workers' Party office and saying to Glotzer, quote, how could you leave a woman who could bake like this, end quote. Most of us were embarrassed, end quote, Geltman said. Geltman, too, was fairly close to Shachtman despite their disagreements. Shachtman had warm ties to other young followers, including Benson and Julius Jacobson. Oh, is that what Julius Jacobson was calling himself? The real blow to Shachtman in the split was his loss of Trotsky's friendship. Trotsky's affection and respect for his disciple were strong, but when the issue between them was the defense of the Soviet Union, affection and respect were strained and then broken. Shachtman's courage in standing up to Trotsky, a man he, quote, loved, respected, and feared, end quote, reflected his sense that he had come of age. Shachtman was 35 years old in 1939 to 40, a man approaching middle age. That's depressing. I'm approaching 35. Hey. A father, his and Edith Harvey's son Michael, was born in July 1939, parentheses, Shachtman was, quote, crazy about his son, end quote. Shachtman was, quote, very fond of children, end quote. Glotzer remembered, quote, he'd just grab them and squeeze their cheeks and kiss them and terrorize them with his enthusiasm, end quote, end parentheses. Shachtman's parents were getting old. Shachtman's mother died in February 1941. Shachtman's age was also suggested by his increasing baldness. Shachtman would no longer sit at Trotsky's feet or accept Trotsky's corrections as he had earlier in the 1930s. Shachtman would not even wait to hear Trotsky's opinion before making up his own mind. Shachtman's self-confidence, nurtured by times he had been right in the past, now reinforced Shachtman's tenacity. Trotsky mourned the distance that grew up between Trotsky and Shachtman. Even as Shachtman's opinions began to diverge from Trotsky, Trotsky praised Shachtman for, quote, excellent ideas and formulations which seemed to me in full accordance with our common position, end quote. In late December 1939, he wrote to Shachtman, quote, I believe that you are on the wrong side of the barricades, dear friend, end quote. But Trotsky added, quote, if I could do so, I would immediately take an airplane to New York City in order to discuss with you for 48 or 72 hours uninterruptedly. I regret very much that you do not feel ... the need to come here to discuss the questions with me, or do you? I should be happy. Shachtman answered Trotsky's appeals with public manifestos. He would neither ask for forgiveness nor give up hopes of receiving it. When Al Goldman ridiculed Shachtman's criticism of Trotsky at the April 1940 Socialist Workers Party convention by sarcastically introducing the party's greetings to Trotsky, quote, the defender of the GPU, end quote, parentheses, Stalin's secret police, end parentheses, Shachtman shouted, quote, you sent your greetings, we will send ours, end quote. Shachtman's followers sent greetings to the, quote, teacher and champion of revolutionary Marxian internationalism, end quote, and expressed the hope that, quote, the events of tomorrow will once more bring us into complete and unshakable union, end quote. When Trotsky was nearly killed in an attack on his house by Stalin's agents late in May, Shachtman sent a message of solidarity, quote, and great relief, end quote, at Trotsky's and his wife's escape. When the next attack succeeded in August 1940, Shachtman mourned his mentor, quote, unbending, intransigent, incorruptible, and tireless, true to himself and to the unflickering ideal of socialist freedom, end quote. Quote, our hearts were torn with grief, end quote, Shachtman wrote to Trotsky's widow, Natalia Sedova. Then Trotsky's forgiveness could no longer be had. Shachtman went down to Mexico to see if he could help or console Sedova. Sedova and Shachtman got along well, renewing a relationship that would continue through the 1940s and 1950s. But Sadova could not help asking why he had not come months before when Trotsky had asked him to. Shachtman often became emotional even years later when he tried to reconstruct his answer to her. He, quote, couldn't face the old man, end quote, he would say. He was afraid that, quote, we would have hollered at one another to no purpose, end quote. Trotsky's friendship was still important to him, and its loss was painful, but making up his own mind had come to matter more. Reaffirming his Marxist identity included, for Shachtman, reaffirming that his Workers' Party belonged to Trotsky's Fourth International. The issues he had raised in the Socialist Workers' Party were international issues, and he wanted the International to discuss them. Shachtman had reason to be optimistic about his chances in the International. Danish, Norwegian, Swiss, Indian, and Sri Lankan Trotskyists and a majority of the International Executive Committee elected at the 1938 Congress came out against Trotsky's position on the Soviet-Finnish War. Footnote. Oh, no, sorry, no footnote. But war interfered with the discussion by bringing repression, censorship, and secrecy to many contributions. By the end of when was the Soviet-Finnish War? Wasn't that later? Wasn't that 1939? Anyway, maybe I'm wrong. But war interfered with the discussion by bringing repression, censorship, and secrecy to many countries. By the end of 1939, the fate of those German, Czech, Polish, Lithuanian, and Latvian Trotskyists who had not escaped was unknown. By the summer of 1940, French, Belgian, Dutch, Danish, and Norwegian Trotskyists were cut off from the rest of the movement by German occupation. Contacts even between the United States and Britain or South America became difficult. In these circumstances, the Trotskyist movement could not have the full discussion Shachtman wanted. Footnote. Trotsky and Cannon punished Shachtman for his split by excluding him from even a preliminary international discussion. In May 1940, U.S., Mexican, and Canadian Trotskyists called a, quote, emergency conference, end quote, that purged the, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, Workers' Party from the International. The conference's claim to represent the world's Trotskyists was dubious. Its list of the 10 countries it claimed to represent varied. One list included the Soviet Union, parenthesis, where all the Trotskyists were dead, end parenthesis. Another, Chile. 2 more of the 10, Germany and Spain, had no real Trotskyist groups at all. A third, Belgium, was cut off from discussion by the war. Trotskyists in Argentina protested that someone had voted for them at the conference, even though they had not authorized anyone to represent them. Brazilian Trotskyists who supported Shachtman protested their exclusion from it. That might be Mario Pedrosa, who was a Brazilian Trotskyist, who I think had like a degenerated, bureaucratic collectivist theory of the USSR of his own. There's a little piece about Mario Pedrosa on this channel. There might be more than one. But there's definitely one from Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. The Workers' Party responded by setting up... Where was I? Brazilian Trotskyists who supported Shachtman protested their exclusion from it. Indian and Sri Lankan Trotskyists who opposed Trotsky's position on Finland were apparently never told about it. International Executive Committee members who supported Shachtman protested that they knew nothing about it. The Workers' Party responded by setting up its own American committee for the Fourth International and keeping in touch with other Trotskyists as best it could. The disappearance or invisibility of so many groups made its purging from the official Fourth International seem meaningless. Quote, the Fourth International as an organized, unified movement with a united political program does not exist, end quote, it concluded. Shachtman saw his group in the early 1940s as an integral part of a movement to rebuild the Fourth International. End footnote. But Shachtman continued to declare his loyalty to the Trotskyist movement. Oppressed people, quote, must plant the flag of the Fourth International all over the world, end quote, he said in 1941. Quote, there is no other way out, none, absolutely none, end quote. Shachtman maintained that despite his disagreement with Trotsky over the Soviet Union, Shachtman and his group were keeping alive the essence of Trotskyism. The theory of permanent revolution, the, quote, defense of the great and fundamental principles of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution, ... the struggle for democracy and socialism, end quote. Shachtman's intransigent defense of Marxism, as he understood it, combined with his spirit of tolerance, made the Workers' Party a place for lively, even iconoclastic debate, which made it stand out among U.S. Trotskyist groups, U.S. Marxist groups. Quote, "The kind of party we have built up is our richest possession," unquote, he said proudly in 1945. He wanted thousands of working people to make it their possession as well. He acknowledged that many were confused by the disunity and conflict between socialists, communists, and two different groups of Trotskyists. But, quote, "When a worker learns that a tool is useful and necessary, he does not throw up his hands in despair merely because there are many varieties of that tool," end quote. He said, quote, "He judges from experience which one really serves the purpose. The purpose best." Jesus Christ, that was a disgusting burp. Ew. I'm sorry you had to hear that. That sounded gross. If you were curious, it didn't taste gross, but it sounded disgusting. Shachtman may have been sure in 1939 to 40 that his position was right and Trotsky's wrong, but as long as Shachtman had neither reshaped nor rejected Trotsky's basic analysis of the USSR as a, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, Shachtman could hardly claim to have a clear position of his own. There were strong pressures on Shachtman throughout 1940 from within his own Workers' Party to take a distinctive theoretical stand. Shachtman shrank from distinguishing his own analysis too sharply from Trotsky's. However, because he linked his efforts to keep the Workers' Party Marxist to a defense of the heritage of the Russian Revolution, remnants of that revolution's victories still survived in the Soviet Union, he argued, in 1940 to 41, and still deserved support from socialists. Even after his campaign in the Socialist Workers Party against unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, he used defense of the Soviet Union as a rallying cry for his loyalists in the Workers' Party. It was also a practical issue for him. In September 1939, and again in April 1940, he predicted that Stalin's hope for avoiding full-scale participation in the war would be disappointed. An attack on the USSR was coming despite all Stalin's maneuvers. Shachtman did not say in so many words whether the tactics that Trotskyists had committed themselves to in 1934, calling for aid to the Soviet Union and opposing any interference with its production or shipment, would be appropriate in response to a German attack. But he stressed the danger of an attack on the USSR and the need to prepare for it. In September 1939, he said that if there were, quote, a direct imperialist attack upon the Soviet Union, ... the defense of the Soviet Union, even under the rule of the bureaucracy, will again become an immediate and paramount task, end quote. He restated the same position in April 1940 and again in December. A capitalist victory over the USSR would, quote, give capitalism and reaction a new lease on life, retard enormously the revolutionary movement, and postpone for we don't know how long the introduction of the World Socialist Society, end quote, he said. At first, Shachtman based his call to defend the Soviet Union on the old Trotskyist definition of it as a workers' state, because Shachtman defined the Workers' Party as the inheritor of the entire Trotskyist legacy. The inherited Socialist Workers' Party position stood. Besides, Shachtman was reluctant to discard Trotsky's theory when he had nothing to put in its place. To the question of what kind of Marxist leader could not say what the Soviet Union was, Shachtman answered half defiantly, half ruefully, quote, well, that's the kind of leader you've got, end quote. But by November 1940, Shachtman had to admit that all but a handful of Workers' Party leaders either rejected Trotsky's analysis or, quote, in grave doubt, end quote, about it. The issue was declared open for debate. People like Carter, Draper, Geltman, and James demanded that the idea of defending the USSR be rejected. Shachtman refused to give in. Shachtman continued to keep the question of defending the USSR open. Shachtman's conclusions laid out in the December 1940 New International were that the Soviet Union was not a worker state. There could be no worker state without workers' political power. It was not capitalist. It had a new bureaucratic ruling class that had to be overthrown in order to create workers' democracy or move towards socialism. Even though every vestige of working-class political power had disappeared in the USSR, the collectivized property created by the revolution survived. Shachtman therefore called the USSR, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote. The economy and state were the collective property of the bureaucracy. Though bureaucratic mismanagement undermined this new form of property, it was showing its superiority for economic and human progress over the anarchy of capitalism. It enabled Shachtman to characterize the USSR as a transitional society, a peculiar product of the epoch in which the world was moving from capitalism to socialism. Marxists therefore had to defend it against any attempt to restore private property. Shachtman's theory was an ambitious attempt to preserve the best of Trotsky's analysis and avoid its limitations. He built into it his own fundamental understanding of both the dangers of Stalinist expansion and the enduring achievements of the Russian Revolution. The theory remains today one of his chief contributions to socialist thought. But like his insistence on the Workers' Party's Marxist identity, it antagonized many of those who had left the Socialist Workers' Party with him. People like Carter, Draper, and Geltman, who also defined the Soviet Union as, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, and James, who argued that the Soviet Union was, quote, of the same inner essence as capitalism, end quote, opposed Shachtman's ideas about the superiority of Soviet collectivism to capitalism. After fierce debate, the Workers' Party's 1941 convention endorsed Shachtman's theory, though he had already begun to slide away from it. The orthodox Trotskyist analysis suffered from two fatal defects in Shachtman's eyes. One was the foolishness of speaking of a, quote, workers' state, end quote, where the workers actually controlled nothing. The USSR was, quote, a workers' prison, not a workers' state, end quote, Shachtman said, quote, there is not the slightest vestige of working-class control left in it, end quote. Its motive force was not workers' interest, but bureaucratic hunger for power and privilege. For socialists who believed that socialism had to be consciously built by the working class, and that democracy was essential to it, to call this a workers' state was at best misleading. Shachtman insisted that democracy was central to any transition towards socialism. Shachtman said unequivocally that without real workers' power, there could be no workers' state. Quote, the proletariat differs from all the classes that preceded the proletariat in history. The proletariat does not own property in the sense that the capitalists own their property, or the feudal lords owned their property, or the slaveholders hold theirs. The proletariat, quote, owns, end quote, social property only by virtue of the fact that the state, which is the repository of the means of production and exchange, is in its hands, is its state, the proletariat organized politically as the ruling class. That's the only way the proletariat can own the means of production and exchange. For this reason, end quote, for this reason, Shachtman was suspicious of any analogy between socialist revolutions and the earlier revolutions that had ensured the triumph of capitalism. There was an essential difference. Bourgeois revolutions had not required conscious leadership by capitalists, because the capitalist economy had already been developing within feudal societies. Removal of the, quote, fetters, blocks, and clamps, end quote, the feudal rulers had put on capitalist development, quote, was all that was essentially required for the triumph of the bourgeois revolution, end quote. The bourgeois revolution could therefore be carried out by a Protestant general like Oliver Cromwell in England, Jacobins in France, or even a landowner like Otto von Bismarck in Germany. But only conscious, organized workers could make socialist revolutions. The socialist economy would function automatically only decades after the revolution. Shachtman said, quote, after civilized socialist thinking and behavior have become normal habits of all the members of the community, end quote. Until then, there could be no substitute for working class leadership at the head of a workers' state. Shachtman was not dogmatic about how a workers' state looked. Shachtman had an ideal, a state founded on democratically elected workers' councils with full democratic freedoms for all. But Shachtman thought that working class power could be expressed through many institutions, quote, its Soviets, its army, its courts, and institutions like the party, the unions, the factory committees, end quote, some of which could atrophy without fatal results. The Soviet Union, in the sum of which could atrophy, in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, where am I? Sorry, I gotta repeat some things. Shachtman was not dogmatic about how a worker state looked. Shachtman had an ideal, a state founded on democratically elected workers' councils with full democratic freedoms for all. But Shachtman thought that working class power could be expressed through many institutions, quote, its Soviets, its army, its courts and institutions like the party, the unions, the factory committees, end quote, some of which could atrophy without fatal results. The Soviet Union in the mid-1920s, when all parties but the Bolsheviks were banned, was still a workers' state for him. So was the Soviet Union even in the early 1930s, when Soviets were rubber stamps and the workers ruled only, quote, through a sick and bureaucratized party, end quote. But when even the Bolshevik Party became a bureaucratic instrument against the workers, as it had by the mid-1930s, Shachtman said that the workers' state had been crushed, quote, to recognize that the bureaucracy cannot be submitted to the proletariat, that the Communist Party cannot be revived, that the regime cannot be transformed, that a new revolution must be organized, is to recognize that Russia is no longer a workers' state, end quote. Important as the argument from democracy was for Shachtman, Shachtman even gave even more attention to a second argument. Trotsky's analysis had underestimated the Soviet bureaucracy's staying power, dynamism, and significance, he said. Trotskyists had predicted that the bureaucracy would weaken the monopoly of foreign trade and allow more and more space for private investment and profit. It did not. Instead, Shachtman said, the bureaucracy, quote, enormously increased the importance of the state property and state production sector, end quote, in the 1930s. Yet there were no higher living standards and no equality or greater freedom for workers. Instead, the workers' bureaucracy had the bureaucracy's power and wealth had grown, and the gap between bureaucrats and workers widened. Soviet democracy was the main obstacle to Stalin's program, which required the, quote, systematic hacking away of every finger of control the working class had over its state, end quote, as well as the bureaucracy's self-purgation and self-transformation, Shachtman explained. The interpretation made sense of the horrors of the Moscow trials, the killings of concentration camps. They were, quote, the one-sided but bloody civil war by which the new bureaucracy definitely smashed the last remnants of workers' power, end quote. Shachtman pointed out that old Bolsheviks who had been in the party since 1917 made up only 1.3% of Stalin's party after the purges. Quote, it is a new party. It speaks for a new class. It is the political organization of the new bureaucracy that overthrew the workers' state, end quote. Given the bureaucracy's strength and rootedness in society, only a deep-going social revolution could overthrow it. Shachtman's disagreements with Trotsky ended with these two: that Trotsky had neglected the decisive importance of workers' democracy and the independent dynamics of bureaucratic power. Quote, most of what we learned about Russia, end quote, he said, quote, we learned from Trotsky, end quote. He agreed with Trotsky that the Russian Revolution had created forms of collective property that were superior to capitalism and had proved their superiority even under bureaucratic rule. Quote, compare 25 years of Russia with 25 years of Poland, end quote, he argued. The Soviet Union's growth had been dramatically higher than in any contemporary capitalist country, despite the fact that the between-war Polish Republic had included the most industrialized regions of the old Russian Empire. Quote, starting at a low level, lowered still further by years of war, civil war, famine, and their devastations, the Soviet Union nevertheless attained a rhythm of economic development, an expansion of the productive forces which exceeded the expectations of the boldest revolutionary thinkers, Economic progress in the Soviet Union was accomplished on the basis of planning and of new collectivist forms of property established by the proletarian revolution, end quote. On this basis, Shachtman continued to believe that the new Soviet society was on a, quote, higher historic plane, end quote, than capitalism. It was a, quote, foreseen mongrelized reactionary part, but a part nonetheless of the collectivist epoch of human history, end quote. Shachtman also agreed with Trotsky that the bureaucracy did not fit in harmoniously with collectivist property forms, but had grown up despite them. Like Trotsky, he blamed Stalinism not only for a lack of democracy, but for mismanagement, disorganization, and inefficiency as well. Shachtman repeated again and again Trotsky's point that democracy had become an economic necessity for the Soviet Union. By the late 1980s, even Soviet rulers belatedly and half-heartedly acknowledged this point. But Mikhail Gorbachev neither gave Trotsky credit nor drew Shachtman's conclusion that overthrowing the bureaucracy would remove, quote, a reactionary obstacle to the development of a collectivist society towards socialism, end quote. Shachtman considered his distinction between the Soviet Union's collectivist property forms, which were progressive, and its bureaucratic property forms, which were not, to be his own major contribution to the discussion. He told Workers' Party leaders in the summer of 1941 that the party had added only two important contributions to the analysis made by Trotsky. This distinction for which he took credit was one: the fundamental difference Carter had pointed out between capitalist and worker states, that workers, unlike capitalists, could not have economic power without political power, was the second. These two contributions, together with what he salvaged from Trotsky's analysis, made up the core of Shachtman's theory. Even if the Soviet bureaucracy in Shachtman's theory was a new ruling class, it was, quote, a unique class in a unique social order, end quote. A, quote, national product of an unforeseen combination of conjunctural historical circumstances, end quote. Like other Trotskyists, he argued that only a delay in the working class rise to world power made bureaucratic collectivism possible even in Russia. Quote, the bureaucracy in Russia became the ruling class because capitalism and the rest of the world remained in power, end quote, he said. Quote, the socialist revolution would reduce this new despotism to ashes, and bracket, the bureaucracy, end bracket, is keenly aware of this fact, end quote. He had not expected to play a major role in world history. It was part of a, quote, transitional order, hence a transitional class, end quote. Shachtman did not adopt in 1939 to 41 or afterwards the position that Cannon raised as a specter against him, that Stalinism in the USSR would mean the end of all hope for socialism. This is a caricature of anything Shachtman ever thought. Even in his last years, Shachtman spoke of Stalinism as only a, quote, historical side motion, parenthesis, quote, a zigzag turn, end quote, and parenthesis, end quote, a byproduct of capitalism's decline and temporary working class unreadiness. Quote, history is not an obsequious engine whose wheels are so set that it can only move forward along a route firmly prescribed by Marxism, without pauses, without ever running backwards, and without ever leaving the main rails, end quote, he said, quote, society has wandered off on side excursions and even blind alleys before, end quote. Quote, the view that Marxism presents an absolute scheme of an iron succession of social orders, does Marx, quote, too much honor and too much shame at the same time, end quote, end quote. Shachtman had, quote, no greater confidence in the longevity of Stalinism than of capitalism, less if anything, end quote, Shachtman. But though Shachtman's analysis was not the heresy of Cannon's nightmares, Burnham had arrived at something like it. Shachtman was afraid that Carter, Burnham's old ally, was following in Burnham's footsteps by refusing to support the Soviet Union against capitalism. Capitalism and Stalinism were not, quote, equally reactionary, end quote, Shachtman said. Capitalism was, quote, the main enemy, end quote. Shachtman warned that Carter's position would have, quote, tragic, end quote, consequences. Germany attacked the Soviet Union in the midst of this debate in June 1941. Many of Shachtman's supporters assumed that he would now swing to supporting the Soviet Union in its war with Germany. The party's Los Angeles members, led by Shachtman, supported by Jack Widick, took this position right away. They were surprised to discover that Shachtman opposed it. Instead, he supported the party's first statement, which dismissed, quote, Stalin's defense of Russia, end quote, as, quote, a defense of the bureaucracy's dictatorial domination, end quote. Carter said that Shachtman had no consistent theoretical basis for rejecting defense of the USSR, and Shachtman's supporters like Ernie Erber agreed. Quote, Stalin can save his own neck only by resisting German imperialism, end quote, Erber said. quote, Stalin's interests coincide with those of the world proletariat, end quote. Another member who favored defense of the USSR said, quote, Comrade Shachtman, some explanation is in order, end quote. Carter supporters were heartened by the disorder in Shachtman's ranks. Shachtman conceded that the nationalized Soviet economy was jeopardized by the German invasion and still said that its destruction would be a loss. Later, he would welcome the news that Ukrainian guerrillas were fighting the German invaders independently of Stalin's government. But he argued now that there was no way to give any support to the Soviet army without supporting Germany's main enemies in the war, Britain and the United States. U.S. aid to the Soviet Union would intensify U.S. involvement in the war against Germany. Quote, shipments to Russia mean convoys and ... Convoys, as our good president says, means a shooting war, end quote. Soviet troops would soon be fighting in defense of British interests in Iran. Worst of all, the Communist International was suddenly portraying Hitler as one important enemy of progressive people, Worst of all, the Communist International was suddenly portraying Hitler as the one important enemy of progressive people everywhere. Communists were urging everyone to join in a grand world alliance for Allied victory. The workers' movement in all the Allied countries was being put in a straitjacket for the duration of the war. The face of these blows to socialism, the fate of the Soviet economy was a secondary concern. Shachtman could still imagine circumstances in which he would defend the USSR. If there was a civil war in the USSR that threatened a restoration of capitalism, he would support Stalin against the capitalist danger. If the right-wingers in Britain who favored peace with Hitler in order to crush the Soviet Union won out, so that Stalin no longer had Britain, parenthesis, and behind Britain the United States, end parenthesis, as an ally, then he would want to defend the Soviet Union. But in 1941, he said, the working class had, quote, more to gain by defeatism with regard to both imperialist camps than it was to gain by defensism in Russia, end quote. This argument seemed to save Shachtman's underlying commitment to Soviet collectivism, but Shachtman resorted to other arguments at the same time that would have meant not supporting the Soviet Union even if it stood alone against German attack. His American Committee for the Fourth International saw Hitler's victory as a force that would sweep Stalinism aside. Quote, Hitler, like the sorcerer's apprentice of the fable, will have set loose the forces of history, bring forth the torrents of revolution, end quote. It said, a prediction disturbingly reminiscent of German communist prediction in 1933. Shachtman also saw the Soviet army as an instrument of Stalin's imperial ambitions. Even in resisting Hitler's armies in their march on Leningrad and Moscow, Shachtman said, the Soviet Union was fighting to regain its conquest of 1939. Quote, we were against the Stalin bureaucracy acquiring those conquests. Who should we defend it? Let me repeat that. I spaced out for a second. Quote, Hitler, like the sorcerer's apprentice of the fable, will have set loose the forces of history, bringing forth the torrents of revolution, end quote. It said, a prediction disturbingly reminiscent of German communist predictions in 1933. Shachtman also saw the Soviet army as an instrument of Stalin's imperial ambitions. Even in resisting Hitler's armies in their march on Leningrad and Moscow, Shachtman said, the Soviet Union was fighting to regain its conquest of 1939. Quote, we were against the Stalin bureaucracies acquiring those conquests. Why should we defend it when it seeks to retain those conquests? End quote. The reasoning behind Shachtman's position in June 1941 assumed consequences of supporting the Soviet war that were not, in fact, inevitable. There was no need to support Soviet troops in Iran in order to support them in the suburbs of Moscow. There was no need to support Soviet advances into Eastern Europe once German defeat was assured. There was no need to call off strikes in the United States in order to speed U.S. aid to the Soviet Union. The danger of deepening U.S. involvement in the war against Germany through U.S. aid to the USSR was small, since U.S. convoys were already risking German attack by delivering aid to Britain. U.S. involvement in the war would be total by the end of 1941 anyway, much as Shachtman had foreseen. The dangers involved in a Soviet defeat, on the other hand, were greater than Shachtman admitted. Hitler meant to turn all the Slav lands to Germany's east into a new German colonial empire. If the German army had occupied Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, a German administration like the ones imposed on the Ukraine and Belarusia would have ruled there for years or decades. Millions of people could have been reduced to virtual serfdom. The resources of the destroyed Soviet Union might have ensured that the Nazis' new order would survive for a generation. The Third Camp, along with the rest of the human race, would have been losers, since anti-Nazi resistance movements would have faced a stronger enemy. Shachtman had pointed out many of these dangers on the basis of his own analysis. Shachtman's position had no dire consequences in the Soviet Union, since he had no followers in the Soviet Union and no impact on U.S. policy. Shachtman's position did have consequences for his own political evolution, however. The argument Shachtman began making against defense of the USSR in 1941 would contribute to his step-by-step abandonment of his own theory of bureaucratic collectivism in favor of Carter's until by about 1948 his differences with Carter had disappeared. Shachtman gradually embraced the implications of Carter's theory that Stalinism could be an even greater danger to socialism than capitalism was, including inside mass movements for social change. Although he would never follow Burnham in giving up on socialism completely, Shachtman would gradually come to see socialism as a distant objective and anti-Stalinism as a more compelling short-term imperative. But in the early 1940s, Shachtman pushed aside such qualms. Shachtman saw the Soviet regime as a relatively minor factor in the war, and Germany, Britain, and the United States as the major players. Shachtman was confident that popular movements born during the war would become another major player and a threat to all the warring governments. He welcomed these movements optimistically, seeing in them hopes for democratic socialism in his time. Thank you so much for listening.